In the classic movie Funny Girl, the inimitable Barbra Streisand reminded us that people who need people are the luckiest people in the world. Well, as the host of a podcast, I of course really need people, and I feel like one of the luckiest people in the world to have been able to have had this week's guest, Kim Masters, on Here Comes Pod. And wow, does she know a lot of people. Kim is an entertainment industry icon, a veteran reporter who has interviewed the titans of the film and TV business, broken stories that have shone a light on malpractice and inappropriate behaviour, as well as chronicling the ever-evolving nature of the business. The early part of Kim's career was actually spent in the political world, including working for the Washington Post and its legendary editor Ben Bradlee. But the 14 years she spent at The Hollywood Reporter really cemented her place as a Hollywood legend, and she now writes for Puck News, the digital service that is helping to redefine the way we consume entertainment news. Of course, Funny Girl is a Columbia Pictures movie, and I first came across Kim's writing in Hit and Run, the book that chronicled the Sony buyout of Columbia and the reign of John Peters and Peter Guber at the studio. I then rediscovered her as a listener to the definitive entertainment podcast The Business, which really has the best film and television people on as guests. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the misty watercoloured memories of the Queen of Hollywood, Kim Masters. Hi Kim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's my absolute pleasure. I always like to start with a fun question to get the creative juices flowing. And in this case, my question to you is, across your career, who is the one person you wanted to interview but never got the opportunity, the one that got away?
Wow, I need to think about that one. I mean, I've been in so many different spaces. I've been in Washington and in Hollywood. I'm sure there are people we've wanted to book on my podcast show, whatever, radio show, that I'll mull that one over and try to come back with a good answer. Because a lot of times we do get people who we want. And I'm sure there is someone. I'm sure we've had wishes, but a lot of times out of the blue, the wish comes true. I would have loved to interview Steve Martin, but I didn't think he would do it. And then suddenly they're like, "Do you want to interview Steve Martin?" It's an easy yes, right? We've gotten a bunch like that.
Steven Spielberg, maybe.
Well, I met Steven on Spielberg on multiple occasions and did a cover story on him for the Hollywood Reporter. So he's
Okay.
Steven. Uh, no, Steven, no. In terms of executives, I think they all eventually come along. I mean, it took a while for me to get Ted Sarandos to sit down with me, but having sat down with him multiple times now, he's not somebody who spills all the tea by any means. He thinks he can just be pleasant and that's a relationship. It's not really, but he can think that.
Okay. I can tell that there's no one I can mention who you haven't had. So
Well,
I
there
can.
probably is. I mean, I let me think. I mean, I would take a Denzel Washington. I seem to be in the process, I hope, of fingers crossed booking Idris Elba, as long as we're in the category of incredible black actors. In terms of celebrity, that's not really the focus of the program. So a lot of times we would not even book a celebrity unless they're sort of a hyphenate and they do more than just star in movies. I will note that the British celebs are almost all educated and smart, and I can't say the same for the Americans. I mean, some are, but a lot are not. I mean, somebody like a Matt Damon or Ben Affleck, both of whom have been on the show, is great because they're interested in the business. Sometimes you'll talk to a star and they just say, "I don't know anything about the business."
Okay, well, you mentioned you're a native of Washington, D.C., or you mentioned that you started out in Washington, and you are a native of Washington, D.C., and worked as a staff reporter at the Washington Post in the early part of your journalism career after starting out at a newsletter called Education Daily. How important was film and TV to you growing up? And did the reality of the Washington Post, or how did the reality of the Washington Post compare to the newsroom so vividly depicted on screen in All the President's Men?
I mean, I was just an ordinary fan of film and TV. I wasn't like some kind of obsessed fan at all. I mean, I liked going to the movies. When I look back, I sometimes get these moments where I'm sitting with a particular talent and like one time it was Dan Aykroyd, and I have this flashback to when I was in college and we would all get into the sort of sitting room of the dorm and watch Saturday Night Live, and you have this "how did I get here" moment. Like it seems really just strange. I did not plan any of this. I didn't seek to cover Hollywood. I actually think that the reason I've been good at covering Hollywood is because I'm treating it like any other beat. The Post, it's funny. I was in Washington before I worked at the Post. I was kind of labeled as a trade reporter. I was at this Education Daily. They put me at the Supreme Court. I was like 22 years old. I couldn't have named four Supreme Court justices. So I was a legal reporter before I knew it. I got labeled as a legal reporter and I did several jobs for trade publications. Then I moved to LA. I felt like it was time to get out of Washington and my job was portable. I could work remotely even in the early days. And I was here for a few years and I stumbled into this not particularly known newspaper, the Daily News in the San Fernando Valley. And I'd really, really wanted to get out of that label of your legal reporter. I honestly thought if they gave me anything, it would be like the courthouse in Van Nuys. But they no, they weren't the top tier and they had to use their imagination. So they came up with the Hollywood idea. And I didn't know anything about Hollywood. I mean, nothing, very difficult. But what I'm trying to get to is after a few years of that, I kind of got a bit sick of it. And I started freelancing for the Post, and they did ultimately hire me not to cover Hollywood, which is crazy. Everybody else, including the New York Times, was trying to hire me to cover Hollywood. And only the Washington Post offered me a more political sort of features beat, but it was in the middle of the culture wars over Robert Mapplethorpe and erotic gay art, and it was a Republican administration, so somehow they had this grant program, and every grant that was objected to happened to be by a gay artist, just somehow. So that was a big conflagration here in terms of the culture wars. And that's what they gave me at the Post. And I really wanted to do that, just get me out of this box. When I was trying to decide, though, I did have some hesitation about moving back to Washington. And I was sort of stressing out and I was running around in my apartment and I turned on the TV. And the first thing I saw was the Washington Post newsroom because they were playing All the President's Men, which felt like an omen. And I will tell you, I mean, I love that movie. I think everybody should have to watch that movie. And the Jason Robart depiction of Ben Bradley, the editor, the heroic editor of the Washington Post, was so perfect. I mean, it was a total thrill for me also as a Washingtonian to work for the paper and the glory of post Watergate. The Washington Post was in its absolute glory. And you had to do an interview with Ben to get hired, and everybody knew it was not a rubber stamp and that everybody else could want to hire you, and he could come out of an interview and just put his thumbs down. And I, meanwhile, the cocky thing that I was like, you better be Ben Bradley. I don't want to meet somebody who's like some disappointing version of the guy on the big screen. And he was totally Ben Bradley. And I could tell very, very quickly that we were going to be fine. And he started telling me these off-color stories. It was very fun. And then he leaned back in his chair and said, "So you want to come to Washington?" And I had this slight hesitation, but I said, "Of course, yes, totally." And he saw it. He said, "Well, what is that? There's a hesitation. Well, why don't you want to come?" And I didn't know if I could say, "Well, I've got this family, I've got this mom, and they've got their, they're all in DC and they're all, I mean, I love them, but they're a lot." And and then the editor of the style section called and says, "Ben thinks you don't want to come." And I'm like, "I want to come. I want to come." And she said, "You could come later." And I'm like, "Not later now." I was not going to play any games about later. So I went. And the Post was, I mean, as long as Ben was there, the Post was that place. It really was. He retired while I was there, and that it changed quite a lot. It changed a lot, and not for the better. Don Graham, who had inherited the job from his mother, the great Catherine Graham, at the publishing job. He just had a vision of the Post as a more local newspaper. It was really like Don Graham is a very nice man, but I think his decisions were bad. He put appointed Len Downey to be the editor, and I believe that it is known in the newsroom that that was not Ben Bradley's choice. And the paper got much more difficult for me as an investigative type of reporter because Len was, I think he had a pathological fear of being wrong. And when I had something that was a scoop, he would, Ben, the first big story I broke on the Smithsonian, I wrote a piece about how this guy had been working, a Smithsonian scientist had been working with these safari club hunters and smuggling endangered animals. He would sell permits to hunt endangered animals to the hunters. And then you can't bring those trophies back into the U.S. He would smuggle them in as specimens for the Smithsonian. So that was a series that led to congressional hearings and all this. The first story ran on the front page. Ben came to my desk and said, "Do you sign autographs?" Which was, a dream come true. I thought I could quit right now and be fine. But Len would be like, "Well, how do you know this? And how do you have it?" He literally said, "How do you have it if the New York Times doesn't?" I said, "Well, isn't that why you hired me?" So I felt this a lot of resistance to the kind of report. I mean, also Michael Isikoff, who's a very strong investigative reporter, left around that time too, because he didn't encourage Ben. Ben was, Ben was a pure guts. I don't think Len was scared of the White House. I think he was just afraid of being embarrassed. Like, what if she's wrong? What if she doesn't really know? Well, then fire me, dude, because you don't trust me. So that became a drag, and I eventually decided and also the politics were starting to tilt in a direction that I don't care for. And I thought I'm going to lose it here with some. I mean, I would be the feature reporter sitting in at these lunches, even with Mrs. Graham and Ben, where Newt Gingrich would be the guest and sit there and flattering everybody. And I thought one of these days I'm going to open my mouth, words will come out. I won't even know I'll just be like in such a state of rage, and then I'll be fired, and then that will be the story. So I thought I would come back to Hollywood. And when I did, Michael Eisner, who was chairman of Disney at the time, called me and said, "Why are you coming back?" And I said, "Because I don't care what you do." And he said, "I get that. Nobody goes to bed hungry because of me." So I do miss Washington in a way. And I feel like had Ben still been there, I would have ultimately become a political news reporter instead of writing, profiles of people like Newt Gingrich or his whatever. But once Ben was gone, that wasn't going to happen with these guys, and I wouldn't have wanted to do it with them. I mean, and Time opened the door. They said, "Would you want to cover the White House?" Well, I had been in the White House, and you know what? It's not that great of a beat, as we've seen demonstrated. It just is. I don't even know what the word is. It's very difficult, I think, to truly distinguish yourself if you're following the president around.
As you mentioned, you did spend time with Vanity Fair, Time, and Esquire, but I think probably people would know your time at the Hollywood Reporter as being definitive because you were there
Well, it's
um,
certainly the longest I've ever worked anywhere by a mile.
2010 for 14 years.
It was a good job.
I'm interested from a journalistic point of view. How did you choose the stories and investigations that you chose to run with at the Hollywood Reporter? Do sources bring you those stories? Do you initiate them, or is it a mixture, or was it a mixture of both?
I mean, a lot of times sources will bring you the story. I mean, you can't start with nothing. You have to at least hear that there may be some kind of a problem. And I mean, I'd say in terms of the Time's Up Me Too stories, the great majority of those were brought to us by people calling to say that they had been assaulted. And that went on for almost 2 years, almost without much of a pause. It became like a beat. I have to say, I was happy I was in a position to do it because it felt important to me. And the impact of writing a story, an expose about someone's sexual misconduct or just straight up misconduct. I mean, I've never been in that position before where a story runs and a person is immediately fired. And you know when you push the button, that's probably going to be it. You know, I know I realize the current administration is trying to make sexual assault acceptable, but I'm still in the space that it definitely is not.
Is there a report or an article that you wrote at the Hollywood Reporter that you'd like to be remembered for?
Well, just off the top of my head, I mean, I think the story that I did with a colleague about the head of Warner Brothers was, and he had gotten involved with this aspiring actress and had to find her roles, which sadly she couldn't act. That one took more than a year. And the degree of difficulty of that one was extremely high. And so I'm very proud that we stuck with it. I'm proud of, and really, I would want to be remembered for all of those Me Too stories, honestly, because none of them was easy. I mean, actually, I'll say there was one where the insiders at a particular company had had enough of seeing this behavior, and they gave us actually it was like a grid, a little chart, who the victim was, what their phone number was, what the incident was. So that one was not the long struggle. I mean, God bless those guys, you know. They just were tired of it. And guys have been sources on those. It's not only the victims and certainly in the head of Amazon Studio and that story about Roy Price who was engaged in sexual misconduct. Guys were the source. A guy came to me with the story, and guys got me over the finish line with that story. So a lot of times when women are talk to me at some event and say, you know, it's so upsetting how this has gone on, and men are dogs or whatever. I'm like, you know, guys have been, especially, you know, in this generation, there are plenty of guys who are not here for that kind of behavior. So that is encouraging. It's hard. I don't have training to deal with sexual assault victims, just going on instinct. But those series of stories, you know, I made sort of a vow. If you come to me with a credible allegation, I will get there one way or the other because I'm not going to just let it go. And you know, if you are there, we had one story with multiple women accusing this host on television on an entertainment show, and that story was extremely difficult. You know, when you do a story like that, you have to go line by line with the lawyers because what happens is they immediately threaten to sue and they have a lawyer write this threat letter. And, you know, if you look at the threat letter, it's so scary. You know, it's false, it's defamatory, it's malicious. Da, 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 da. I have learned to take those letters in stride. My colleagues would panic, but I'd be like, I could wallpaper my house with these threats. However, when they do the threat, you know, then our lawyers are going to jump in. We usually have had them look at it before we even, you know, go to the source, just so we know that we're airtight. But even if we are airtight, we're going to go over it again, line by line, word by word. And good lawyers will help you get there. There was quite a revolution in how the lawyers saw these stories, but you know, because I started on the Amazon Roy Price story before Harvey Weinstein was exposed, you know, in the New York Times and the New Yorker. And our lawyers gave me a terrible time. This guy had hired a very aggressive lawyer who had won a huge lawsuit, Hulk Hogan against Defamer, I guess. Was it Defamer? No, Gawker. You know, Gawker. Gawker had collapsed as a result of the verdict. And I would say to our lawyers, you know, this was not a misconduct allegation. He brought a jury trial in Florida for invasion of privacy because there was a sex tape. There's no invasion. None of those elements are present. But our lawyers were so frightened by this guy, by Roy Price's lawyer, that they just made it very, I couldn't really publish. And one of the problems is the main accuser, or she wasn't even the accuser, the main victim of his misconduct that we knew about was very hesitant to go on the record. She was running a pretty successful Amazon show. She was worried about what would happen to her cast and crew. She was worried about her kids reading that their mom had been treated a certain way. But once Harvey happened, she circled back and went on the record. And we finally got the whole thing out in the open. I will note that there are things we know that we can't always publish. Like we may know and believe to be true, but sometimes, you have to say, if this were to go to court, would this witness come forward? Would the witness testify truthfully? And if it feels at all shaky, we don't publish it. People seem to think that we're just doing whatever, republishing allegations. The bar to publish is high. And I don't even blame the guys for lawyering up because their career is on the line. So of course we're going to be careful, but no one should think it's easy. So I guess the question of what I want to be remembered and hope I will be remembered for is that being part of the Time's Up moment and speaking up for victims. Towards
And
the end there, like Chris Noth was one of the most, I think the most famous person I wrote about, the actor from Sex and the City and Law and Order and Good Wife, all kinds of shows. He didn't even send the letter. I mean, I don't think he even bothered. Towards the end there, I think a couple of these guys got a little smart and thought maybe they shouldn't waste their money on these expensive lawyer legal letters. And they just kind of call and say, well, it's not true. Okay, thanks.
alongside reporting, you're also an author with two books that dug very deep into Hollywood. Published in 2000, The Keys to the Kingdom took a deep dive into the Michael Eisner reign at Disney. But prior to that, 1996's Hit and Run, which you co-authored with Nancy Griffin, is a book that is required reading for any Sony Pictures or Columbia Pictures employee, and I can testify to that personally, having been one of those. Publishers Weekly called the book a shocking read that will have readers gasping at the obscene overindulgence of Hollywood. But I've actually had quite a few guests who were at Columbia Pictures during that period of time who actually speak very fondly of that period. I think because of things like the renovation to the studio lot, which they all really appreciated, and actually that the
It was a
movies.
dump before. It was a bit of a dump, and they would have been on in Burbank if Sony hadn't screwed up in hiring John Peters and Peter Gruber. But as it happened, they ended up in Culver City, and certainly Peter made the best of it in terms of renovating it. I mean, I wouldn't say his first concern was worrying about his employer's money.
Well, it was certainly appreciated by the employees, and I also think that a lot of people who were there at the time felt that the movies became more commercial, for example. So a lot of those people.
Movies failed though. I mean, the movies, if we knew very well, we were offered the book just as John and Peter were taking the job at Sony. And the entire premise was that they were going to fail and fail big. And once in a while, I was in Washington for a part of this, and I would come out to LA to do some reporting. And once in a while, Nancy would call me because she was in LA, and she'd say, "Oh, they've got this movie. I think it was Dracula, was it? I think that was a
Bram Stoker's Dracula.
yeah, and there's a lot of good buzz. There's a lot of great buzz." And I would say, don't worry, it's not really going to work. I mean, I would just say it on belief. And because the truth is, if they had had a Batman-sized hit, that would have screwed us. There would be no book. So some of the movies did okay, but they never had a breakout blockbuster movie the whole time. And they had a lot of flops.
So, what was the experience like of researching and writing the book, and what was the reaction from within and outside the studio when it was published?
I mean, the studio is not a monolith. I think it was varied. A lot of people were offended in and out of the studio because Peter Guber kept saying things like, they haven't bought me, they just rented me, and I'm not here forever. And it's to hear your boss act like, I'm not really invested 100% here. And meanwhile, let me spend as much of their money or get as much into my pocket as I possibly can. People were offended by that. I mean, it was sort of a mixed reaction. I don't know. I hardly talked to everybody in the studio. There were people who thought I mean, it was like a joke, basically. They thought it was funny. They were in real time. They were like, look at these guys go. I mean, John didn't last that long because Peter fired him, which of course John is upset about to this day. John was he's a wild being. I mean, the idea of John in an executive job is ridiculous. And this, my assumption is that Sony, to them, all of us Westerners look like crazy, over emotional, uncontrolled people. So they just didn't realize that there's a spectrum, and John is on the end of the spectrum. It's like, don't give this guy an executive job. So so, I mean, there were people who were sort of entertained, jealous, angry. There was a gamut of things that they managed to tap into. I mean, we had tremendous cooperation. If otherwise, the book wouldn't happen. I think at one point my phone was being tapped, and it made a lot of noise. Which, having now read about the Anthony Pellicano phone tapping of that era, that's how it was. And people would comment when they were talking to me on my phone, like, what is that noise? And I'd be like, I don't know. And I thought, if you want to tap my phone, knock yourselves out. I'm not doing anything that I'm hiding. And if you want to hear what people really think of you, and I don't think it'll make you happy, but go ahead and listen. And then my editor at Vanity Fair, who I was juggling a lot of plates at that point, the Post, Vanity Fair, he said, just get the phone swept. I'm sick of this. And it stopped that day. So, they maybe were listening, but they certainly didn't hear. I mean, with Peter, I felt like there was no phone call that did not end up rewarded with a reward. Like towards the end, I was getting like tired. We had been working and working, and he had taken people on this camping trip with, china and porcelain, this and that, and and masseuses and violinists, all this Peter stuff. And I thought, like, should I call the outfitting company that took this got on with taking him on this trip? Are they even going to talk about a client? I mean, should I really track these people down? And sure enough, I call and they're like, oh, that guy, he drove us crazy. He had to have over and over again, what is the best shoe? What shoe should I buy? What should I have? And like all of this, Peter is all about the story of Peter. Unfortunately, he failed to try to really spin us. I think he was scared, honestly. He did meet with Nancy once and blew a lot of smoke up at her about, oh, we should have a documentary division when someone like you should be in charge. And Nancy comes out and like, Peter's famously charming when he wants to be. He never tried it on me. I was like, come on, try me, come on. I want to see if you can do it to me. But she came out and said, he was really, and I was like, Nancy, snap out of it. There will be no documentary division. This is all bullshit. And she did snap out of it. She realized that what she had gotten caught up in that spinning of the Peter Guber yarn that he did so well. He literally ran away from me at a party once. I was at an inauguration party in Washington, and he was there. I think Warner's threw the party. And I saw him from across the room. I didn't really know him. I don't know if he would recognize me, but he winked. And I thought, are you winking at me because you know who I am, or are you winking at me because like I'm a girl? And they were talking to Terry Semel, who was the co-chairman of Warner's at the time. And Terry kind of gestured, come over, which was mean looking back. And I went over to them and everybody's smiling and nodding. And then Terry says to Peter, and his wife, Linda, was there, who's now called Tara. He said, do you know who this is? And they shook their heads, and Terry said, "This is Kim Masters." And they both went and literally ran. And Terry and I were laughing. I said, "You really should talk to him about this. This is a little extreme." But that was it. That's the one time. So I feel like, he subsequently has said the reason the book came out the way it did is because he failed to tell his story. I felt like, dude, the door is wide open. Let's do it now. Come on my show.
So that would be a fantastic episode. And so, talking about the show, from an early part of your career, you were a radio correspondent with NPR as well as a print journalist, and since 2006 have hosted the definitive radio show and podcast devoted to Hollywood called The Business. How did you get involved with the business?
Well, how did I get involved? I think that at a certain point, I think maybe when I was writing for Esquire, I just had time on my hands. I had a column every other month, and I always thought public radio seemed cool and fun, and all of that. And I was trying to figure out how do you do it. And there was a show which I don't know if you probably don't have. It's called Marketplace, and it's a business show. And I called them and I said, would you want someone to talk about like doing some analysis on deals or whatever? And they were like, yes, we would be interested in that. Give us some ideas. And then I proceeded to give them ideas, and every single time they'd say, nah, no, no. And I finally thought, okay, this isn't really how you act if you want to do something. You're not talking to me on the phone about how we could shape this into a thing you do want. And then months went by, and they called me and they said, would you like to come in and do something and, see if you're fit to do stories for us? So I said, sure. And I went, I had to do this voice test, which I'd never even thought about. And they looked very happy. I thought, okay. They basically taught me radio very slowly. It was brilliant. Like in the beginning, it was like, could you do a 3-minute piece for next week about this? And I'd be like, yes. And over time, it was like, could you do it for this for tomorrow? And then, how about could you turn it around today? And I just slowly learned how to deal with that stuff. At which point, NPR quickly poached me. It was quite bitter because I think it was not done normally to poach on-air talent, but NPR did it. And, NPR was the big show, so I had to go. But Marketplace was very good to me. And NPR is interesting. I came from a print perspective, and at NPR they have this combined attitude of, well, you're a print reporter, so you can't do radio. At the same time, like, well, you're a print reporter, so you're a better, you do more in-depth reporting. So it's like you have the greatest superiority and inferiority complex going at the same time. But I actually clearly found radio very doable. I mean, I remember when I first did a 4-minute story at Marketplace, this guy said, okay, Dominic, this is the equivalent of a 6,000 word piece for Vanity Fair. And I felt like, dude, I've written 6,000 word pieces for Vanity Fair. Let me assure you, this is not at all like that. I mean, that was crazy. So, but it was fun. I mean, I liked it. I thought I would stay forever, and then the recession hit, and they laid off almost the entire West Coast bureau, and I had to start again, which turned into a tremendous piece of luck because I would have stayed, and I would not have gone to the Hollywood Reporter, and the Hollywood Reporter was an amazing job. It made a huge impact in my life, you know. I mean, we
Absolutely.
went through multiple owners, but the long and short of it is, despite all of that and some bad things that happened under certain management, where they were not interested really in integrity, you know, it still was overall a really good experience with a bunch of people I'm very fond of. It's hard to leave.
I'm sure, particularly after such a long period of time. On a recent episode of his podcast, Revisionist History, fellow writer and podcaster Malcolm Gladwell talked about the difference between conversation and interviewing.
He was a former Washington Post colleague, by the way.
Oh, okay, so you you
We
you
were not
know.
particularly friends, so.
Oh, okay. Well, I listen to a variety of podcasts, and I enjoy all of them. He said interviewing is much, much harder than conversation. But do you know what's even harder? Performance. The interview conducted for the benefit of someone else, the audience. Does the performance element of your work on the business impact the way you prepare for the interviews?
No, I just don't think that way. I'm not performing. I'm acting as a journalist. I mean, I think sometimes about, what would be interesting to the listener, but I don't see that as performance. I think my job is to go in, listen to the answer, and have a conversation, I sometimes have to ask a difficult question. And again, not a matter of performance, it's just a matter of ethics and integrity and not pretending that I don't know something that I do know. So I just think we see this differently. I think, Malcolm Gladwell, he in a podcast once talked about the Washington Post and how he had this thing going with another reporter of trying to put certain words into stories. Basically, he was talking about things that would have not passed muster with Ben Bradlee at all. And he was very, when people asked him, like, well, for example, one of the colleagues he had talked about said this didn't happen. I mean, it would have been very damaging. That guy was still at the Washington Post. So, he was very kind of a little cute about whether it did or didn't happen. That may be performance from his standpoint. I'm not into that. I don't do that.
But you have actually done some performing in that you played yourself in The Good Wife, for example. And
The funniest thing about that, at the end of this episode, Chris Noth, who was playing this ne'er-do-well politician, actually says the words, Kim Masters was right, or Kim Masters was telling the truth. I thought, what are the odds? Why didn't anybody clip that when I did the story that about his behavior? But go ahead, sorry.
no, that's okay. But also, I suppose a bit more on the documentary side of things, because you've appeared, I think, somewhat famously in Going Clear, but there was also Lorena and Weinstein in Court. So, what's it like
Yeah.
being on the other side of the microphone?
I mean, if you're comfortable with the outlet, you get used to a microphone. I don't think about it so much anymore. I mean, you almost get this illusion for me anyway that, well, everybody goes on television, don't they? And I realize that's not literally true, but somehow in my head, I have so many friends I see on television or colleagues, like, look, we all go on television. Uh, with Harvey, he tried to preclude that because he offered me a book deal shortly before I mean, I knew what was about to happen with him. He knew that I knew. And he called and, well, first he emailed and I didn't respond. And then he called and he said, I have this great, we have a publishing company, which I don't think they did at that point. I think that was just BS. And he said, I have this great idea for a book you could do for us. And I was like, we're not having this I mean, I was sorry I picked up the phone. He must have been using a different number that didn't come up on my phone. And I think he was doing it to preclude me from doing what I did do, which was to go on TV and do documentary. I mean, TV literally around the world, Australia, Asia, Europe, multiple outlets. I mean, he knew that I would be pulled into it that way, and he was trying to figure out a way to make it not happen. I guess he was pretty desperate at that point. And only wonder, like, okay, so how much were you going to pay me for this book? Like, what did you think? Because I didn't engage enough to hear a number, but I'm very curious what he thought would be a number that would actually hope in his hopes buy my silence. So I haven't reached out to ask him, but but that was a moment, yeah, with old Harvey. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy to go on, especially, like when the Sony hack happened, there were these pundits on the East Coast who are always convinced they know more than anybody on the West Coast. And they didn't have a clue what they were talking about. They were this was around the interview with Seth Rogen. And my position was that it was not responsible to allow Seth Rogen to portray the sitting head of a foreign country with nuclear capabilities and just say no to them and say, you can make it a Kim Jong-un type of character. And I said this on many shows. I was on CNN every day at that point. And these other people were framing it like, well, this is a freedom of expression issue. And I'm like, dudes, this is not a small independent film or a work of art. I mean, you may like it a lot and think it's funny. This is a piece of business for a studio. And at that time, Amy Pascal was running Sony. And I said, I just don't believe that anyone else, I'm certainly Rupert Murdoch, not a chance in the world, right? Not a chance, because honestly, it's a terrible idea. You could convey the concept. You don't make it that person and kill him on a joke. I mean, and they paid a horrible price.
You left The Hollywood Reporter earlier in 25 to join the digital service Puck News. What excited you about the move to Puck? And does writing for a digital publication differ from the journalism that you did at The Hollywood Reporter?
What appealed to me? Well, things were getting difficult at the Hollywood Reporter in terms of, Hollywood is having challenges and journalism is having challenges, and there were rolling layoffs going on. One after another. It was not a great time, and I really had a concern that I published what I wanted to write at the Hollywood Reporter, and if anybody hesitated, believe me, I got it to be published. When I mean, I would resign if they wouldn't publish. something because they were afraid. This happened with Amazon. Amazon threatened to pull and did pull millions of dollars in advertising for a story I did about their management with the person that, as it turns out now, they had very recently fired. And they pulled millions in ads. I mean, this is Jeff Bezos's company, and when you see what he's doing at the Washington Post, he's not exactly a free speech warrior. But I was worried that as the advertising diminished, the threat to pull advertising from a trade public, I mean, when we didn't consider Hollywood Reporter a straight up trade at that when it relaunched, it was kind of like I would say it's like, Variety and Vanity Fair had a baby, and we had this glossy magazine, and it was very fun, especially in the beginning, very fun. And it didn't happen, but I got worried, very worried that it would happen, that they would say, well, Warner's has a big ad buy and could you just back off? So I just didn't want to wait for that to happen. And meanwhile, Puck was, Matt Bellany had been my editor at Vanity Fair and ultimately the editor at Vanity Fair, at Hollywood Reporter, sorry. And we knew each other very well, worked
Partner in
together.
banter.
Yes, my partner in banter on on my KCRW show, The Business, yes. Uh, I mean, I think people at Puck are sort of taken aback by the way I talk to Matt sometimes because the comfort level is, and Matt is also he's strong-willed and he you have to really get him to focus. Sometimes you have to get his attention. But Matt, the things seem to be going well at Puck. And I thought, well, I had hoped it would be less work. I told him I would take less money, a lot less money for less work. It's been a little bit more, it's early days still, but it's been more work than I intended. And it's partly my fault because I do assign myself pretty much what I'm going to write. And I should give myself a break and come up with something easy. But I just thought, well, it's time to do something else. And honestly, Puck was the only option that I felt like I was interested in, because I mean, I could have gone around I'm sure certainly the places that would have at least tried to come up with a way to hire me if they did. I acknowledge I have a reputation for being expensive, and my salary was definitely eventually blown up to a expensive number by Jay Penske, the owner of the Hollywood Reporter. Uh, so thank you, Jay. But I just felt like Puck is, win or lose. I mean, these are very difficult times in journalism, but the idea that, you can write, it's more of an opinion-y column, an analysis. I did some of that at Hollywood Reporter. It's not like I never did. I did plenty. So, but it felt like Puck would let me write what I want to write. You know, they're not as reliant on like the FYC, the for your consideration ads, as the Hollywood Reporter. I felt like, this it's a different model, not as Hollywood dependent. So I thought, what the heck? And Matt had said to me from the beginning, do you want to come along? And when he was starting it up, I thought, well, let's see what happens here. I've been at startups before. It's a very exhausting proposition. Matt has the energy of like so many thousands, like a battalion of an army. Uh, but I didn't want to get engaged in that again. So, I let it simmer for a while, and I really did agonize, to be honest, about whether I wanted to leave my colleagues because they felt like I think most of them genuinely felt like I was, a person that they felt good about working with, a mentor to a lot of them. And I felt like I was abandoning my children. But they knew it was coming, they knew that things weren't going. I mean, I think a lot of them, I'm sorry to say, might have left also if the market weren't so screwed up in journalism.
As we reach the 20th anniversary of you hosting the business, can you sum up the big changes in the industry in your time at the show, and how would you summarize or
Well,
uh,
everyone in Hollywood talks about this all the time. I mean, Hollywood is not fun right now. And I mean, Hollywood was in the era of hit and run, as much as there was ridiculous conduct and some really bad conduct. I mean, Hollywood was a wild, creative, fun place. It was I get on the phone with these, my sources who are not young people, some of them, and they talk about how they're glad they're not as much in the business or the Hollywood I covered when I started covering it. You had people like Jeffrey Katzenberg, Barry Diller, David Geffen. None of them went to college. All of them were self-made. All of them became very, very wealthy. Nowadays, you need a degree to work in the mailroom at an agency. And lawyers and suits, are in charge. The tech bros have come in. Netflix to me drives me absolutely nuts because they came in here. I mean, all credit to them for the idea of the red envelopes, the way they managed to transition even somebody who's a little bit of a technophobe like me into the streaming service, uh, and their dominance. You can't, whoever mocked them as the Albanian army, they clearly were very, very wrong. But they come in with the outsider arrogance of the tech bro, like we're going to do it. We're smarter than you dummies, and we're going to do it this way. And little by little, they've the joke here is they've invented television, right? They weren't going to do advertising, except now they do. All of these things, the only thing they've held the line on, and I think most of Hollywood would agree it's not really rational, is theatrical. Not for necessarily for every movie. I think we've kind of established that movies you better not spend much on a movie for streaming because the only way I think that really it's clear that it works if it's in a theater better it works better when it comes to the streamer. So why Ted Sarandos has dug his heels in, or maybe it's Ted and his sidekick, his co-CEO, or Reed Hastings, whatever, little by little, replicating like all the dumb ideas they weren't going to do, and they've just then the other studios got sucked into trying to chase them. Wall Street had a big role saying, "Well, we need big subscriber numbers," and then the minute they started losing, insane amounts of money trying to keep up and get that, the legacy studios, Wall Street turns around and goes, "Well, we really would like to see you earn money." I'm like, wow, what a concept. Who came up with that? So I feel like the industry has been dragged through what is clear. Yes, it's a technological revolution, and the pain of that has just taken away a lot of the joy. Now, did Netflix bring us things that we love? Yes. I'm, amazed by adolescence, or I enjoyed many, many things at Netflix. I think little by little it's fewer and fewer. I mean, they seem to just hold on to enough stuff to keep me from canceling. Only just though. I mean, I spend more time on other services. I feel like now the legacy studios are fighting for their lives because not just the tech stuff, but pandemic, couple of strikes, and the pandemic was, a studio that where you're seeing that movies are working, and this question of how long of a run do they get in theaters is like that you've got to be willing to let the movie sit in the theaters for a while. You can't, if you pull it off too fast, everybody gets trained to not go if they want to see it and wait. So the legacies are grappling with existential change. We've already seen Fox vanish because Rupert was like, "I'm out." Warner's and Paramount are on the precipice, right? I mean, we'll have some survivors and some who won't. Some of these legacy names will go away. I mean, Warner Brothers Discovery just announced we're going back to HBO Max, having taken the name, one of the valuable brands in the entire industry, out of the title. They just went the other way and realized, oops. I mean, the whole thing is absurd, and people are so angry about it. But that, my comment was, so then what's going to be next? Is it going to be HBO Max Paramount Plus or HBO Max Peacock? Where are we going here? The herd is thinning. It's very sad to see Warner's in this situation. Warner's is the Tiffany of the studios. They used to be living the largest they had a place in Acapulco, and they had a fleet of jets, and they would fly the talent. And I mean, that was a hell of a lot more fun than what we're dealing with now, which is constant cutting and klutzy decision making. by a bunch of these people, like Sherry Redstone. I'm not too impressed with that. David Zaslav, don't even get people started. I mean, Comcast looks strong, but probably try to get bigger. Then we'll see what Apple wants to do. Who knows? But only the strong are going to survive. Paramount was a melting ice cube, and I do feel a little sympathy for her position that in that her father did a lot of damage, Sumner Redstone, to that company, and then died or had to hand it over to her, foolishly refusing to deal with a responsible transition and then allowing the company to be pillaged by Philippe Domon. And then the whole drama with Les Moonves at CBS. I mean, there's just been a lot of stuff stacked against her. But having said that, she's made a lot of terrible decisions too. So now she's in this bind with Trump in the White House holding their merger with Skydance hostage, and that's disgusting. But I mean, but also, is everybody assuming that David Ellison knows how to run Paramount in this environment? I mean, there's a lot of unknowns there. So it's a time of a lot of fear and struggle. I mean, Hollywood's always been run on fear to a large degree because success is so hard to figure out. Like, why did this work and this didn't work and this had all the elements and failed and this came out of nowhere. And as the famous quote, nobody knows anything, is still true. But I don't know. It's a fearful. I mean, it's fear on steroids now because people are losing their jobs and production is leaving Los Angeles and California. And what is he's talking about with tariffs? He wants to put tariffs on what? You want to let his nose in the tent of anything to do with a creative medium? I think he might want to wait on that and wait until we somebody who's not crazy is in the White House.
So, my final question with your long association with public broadcasting, if PBS asked you to schedule a night of programming, which three TV series or movies would you choose for this, what we're calling Masterpiece Theatre evening of
Funny.
entertainment?
I think I would go with All the President's Men because it is a illuminating. I think I would go with The Wire because it's great. And the third slot, I don't know quite what gets the third slot. Oh, I know. I'll put in the great BBC version of Pride and Prejudice. Or maybe The Way We Live Now, a Trollope book, which is a brilliant series also. One of those. Culture.
Very good. Well, Kim Masters, thank you so much for being a guest on Here Comes Pod. It's been a fascinating walk through a storied career, a bit more of a stay and chat rather than a hit and run, and a reminder that when it comes to reporting on Hollywood, you are very much the business.
Thank you very much for having me.